This is our block for block 5. Really cute little block. It's called film strip. And you can see that it kind of looks like a little checkerboard, but I like it because of the name. Some of us are in the generation where we remember when teachers used film strips in the classroom to share extra information. Some of us who taught remember when we used film strips in our classrooms to share extra information. And so, nevertheless, here's a block. The block is by Scott Merkin, and he calls this little block film strip. I think it's going to go together very quickly, very easily, but I'm just happy to have it in my sampler quilt. You can see the various fabrics that Scott has in it right here, and then of course we get to change those selections to what we want. But our block number 5 is Film Strip by Scott Merkin. Here are the pieces that I've cut. They're all laid out. And this time I decided to make this a 2-color block. I love this very dynamic, very vibrant um, green. It has blue in it, it has some beige in it, and it just has a myriad of colors. And then I use the beige grunge. I know it looks white, but it's really a very light beige grunge. And I use that for my 2.5-inch squares here, as well as my 4.5-inch square in the middle. So when the block is completed, it will be a 2-color block, and I think it really will be a dynamic block. And it's the very same block here. And we always have that option as quilters to take a pattern that we see and to make it ours. And we can always think of a way, or we see the pattern in a way that maybe the person who designed it didn't see. And we can use our imagination to change the block so that it becomes ours. So what I need to do now is go to the sewing machine. And the first thing I'm going to do is sew B to A, and then sew this B to A, and I'm pressing all of my seam allowances toward the B in this case. And when I sew this on, this is C, when I sew that on, the seam allowances will be pressed toward C. And as I press them, I will show them to you. I like the idea of pressing seam allowances toward a border or something that represents a border as opposed to toward the inside. So that really does determine how I press my seams. But I'm going to get these sewn on, and once I do, I will show that to you, and then we begin to sew the 2.5-inch squares on. Here I've sewn B on to A, and let me just pick it up. And you can see that the two sides are sewn on, and I want you to see how I press the seams. Both seams are going from A toward the B because B is similar to a border, and I like to press toward the border. Now I have to sew, and you will want to do this before you sew the C on. You want those seams pressed before you come to C here and this C. So I'm going to the sewing machine to sew those two on and press those seams and show you what they're like. I've sewn the two B's on, and now I've also sewn C and C. And here they are. You can see how the seam allowances are pressed so that the seam allowances go toward the piece that I sewed on. So B, according to our directions, here we are right here. B is on each side of A, and C is at the top and bottom of A. And that's what I've done. Now we need to sew the 2.5-inch squares together. And notice where they are. Here are 3, and here are 3. We're going to sew those together first, working from the side. Then we will sew these together, working from the top to the bottom. And so right now I'm going to the sewing machine and I'll sew these 3. That's going to be a white, a color, and a white. And over here the same thing, a white, a color, and a white. I've sewn these 2 sides together, these D's together, and they go on either side of the ABC unit. And I want you to notice that this time I press the seam allowances toward the darker fabric. Knowing me, I probably would have pressed all of these in the same direction, but because I have a dark fabric and a light fabric, I chose to press toward the dark fabric. And that's a decision you'll make when you work on this block for yourself. Okay, now you can see where we're going next. According to our little guide here, I'm going to sew this D unit to the ABC unit, and then this D unit to the ABC unit. That will be my very next step. We can see the block growing, especially the middle of it, because now we have the ABC unit and we have the D units attached. And so now it's a matter of sewing our 2.5-inch squares together for the top, and then sewing our 2.5-inch squares together for the bottom. And once we have done that, we will attach those to this middle unit. Quick little block, but very dynamic anyway. So let me get those squares sewn and then I will show you what they look like. Okay, I have sewn these squares together, and once again I press the seam allowances toward the darker fabric simply because I could. Ordinarily, knowing me, I would have pressed them all in the same direction, but here is the one for the bottom and here is the one for the top, and the seam allowances are pressed toward the dark fabric as well. And so now we're down to our last step. Next to the last step, we're going to connect these units that are called D units as well. This top D unit connects to the middle unit, and this bottom D connects to the middle unit. And the last thing we will have to do will be to sew the strips around the outside. The side rectangles have been placed onto the unit. So the next thing we have to do will be to put the rectangle up here, that 1.5 by 12.5 inch rectangle, and the same measurement rectangle down here, and the block will be completed. Now I have sewn the 2 D units on, the one across the top, the one at the bottom. And I want to caution you when you sew yours on that you want to make sure you pay attention to the seams connecting. You want a nice straight seam all the way down here, and the same thing on this side. So be sure that when you're putting them together, you get that real demarcation of seaming in there. So we're almost at the end with this wonderful little block. And the next thing we need to do is to sew strips at the top, strip at the bottom. No, I'm wrong. We're going to start with the sides, just like we've been doing all along. We'll do the sides and then come back and top and bottom. These are our 1.5 by 10.5 inch strips, and these are our 1.5 by 12.5 inch strips. They don't call them strips, they call them rectangles, but you and I know that that's the same thing. So I'm going to get these on, and show you what the block looks like. The side rectangles have been placed onto the unit. So the next thing we have to do will be to put the rectangle up here, that 10.5, that 1.5 by 12.5 inch rectangle, and the same measurement rectangle down here, and the block will be completed. Here is our completed block. Very pretty block, I think, and the two colors work so well. And while I'm looking at this, I want to say a little bit about cutting our African fabrics into little pieces. So often we are reluctant to do that. But when we cut them into little pieces and pair them with another fabric that allows them to keep their original integrity, we can get something quite beautiful. This is the original fabric from which this was taken. You can see it has a large design, very large design. And the colors weave in and out. There's some blues, greens, browns, beiges. And so when we look at this, so many of us are reluctant to cut this into little pieces. But when we put them with something that is high in contrast, very high in contrast, and we allow them to be placed in such a way that they can keep their integrity, they're still beautiful. You don't see the really big design in this, but you do see how dynamic it is, how colorful it is, how pretty it really is, and you do see the integrity of the fabric. So keep that in mind as you have those African fabrics in your stash and you're still reluctant to cut them. Start cutting them. They will be okay. You just decide the pattern you use and decide how you're going to put it together, and you can still get something quite dynamic. And anyone who looks at this will know that this is an African fabric. They may not know that it had a big print, but then there are hints of the big print throughout the block. Now, earlier on in the introduction to our sampler quilt, I told you that I'm making 2 of each block. So I did make another one of these blocks, and I'd like to share that with you. Here is the other block using this same film strip pattern. And this one I added, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different fabrics. I like it, and I'm not so great about it. One, the burgundy in this African fabric doesn't quite work with the burgundy here. So I should not have put this fabric in here. There it is, 1, 2, 3, 4. I should have used something else. I think if I had used another color, maybe the blue African fabric that I have, that would have worked better than having these burgundies so close together. And so that's a lesson learned. And sometimes you don't get those lessons until you put the blocks together. But given another choice now, I would not have included this particular fabric in this block. I would have used something else. I think I have a blue African print back there that I think would have worked better. Who knows? It may have clashed with this blue. And maybe the solution to this would have been not to use this fabric at all. And here it is around the center square, and here it is surrounding the block. And maybe that's the fabric that I should have left off of this. So it is a learning process. When you do this, you discover things that you would not have seen ordinarily and that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. So go ahead and make your blocks. Please cut your African fabrics. They weren't designed to just sit and look at you and let you look at them. They were designed to be used. Just try to use them in a way that they can sparkle and dance and be exactly who they are. And you remember, I think of them as divas. And this particular diva is having the time of her life in this block because she has no competition, none. This little guy is willing to sit back and just let her dance and sing and be who she is. That's what we want to do with our African fabrics. And now that the block is finished, we can go back to the directions. Our little chart, let's see, let me get it on the screen. That's our little chart for putting it together. This is off of the page in which the block is located in the book. And I'll also hold up the cutting instructions for you like I normally do. Thank you so much, and soon get ready. Block 6 is on the way.